This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today I'm starting a new series of MTG Top 10s that will cover a new topic, lands. While I've done some MTG Top 10s on lands before, looking at things like legendary lands, lands that add mana of any color, and lands that don't produce mana, I wanted to do a series on lands of every color. Now, I know that all lands are colorless, but this series is going to look at lands that have activated abilities or can add mana of a specific color, and I thought before we get to each color, it would be good to start by looking at lands that can only produce colorless mana and don't have any colored mana symbols in their text box. Obviously, I mean non-basic lands here. Wastes doesn't count, so that's what we're going to look at today. To qualify for this list, a land had to only be able to produce colorless mana. This means that even lands that technically are colorless in terms of color identity, but can add mana of any color, did not qualify for this list. So, being a land that can only add colorless mana is a pretty big drawback. In most decks, you are making your mana base worse by including them. This means that lands that have this limitation have to do some pretty awesome stuff to make up for it. And the lands on this list definitely do some powerful things. This is one of the more stacked lists I've ever done. The number 10 card on the list has 102 points. Before we get to that card though, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Mythic Championship, or Players Tour top 8 is worth 2 points, as are Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s, and a Grand Prix or Magic Fest top 8 is worth 1 point. Alright, let's see what number 10 is. At number 10, it's Mishras Workshop, a land that can, impressively, tap for 3 colorless mana. Sure, that mana has to be used on artifacts, but that doesn't matter. If you can produce 3 mana on turn 1 with only 1 land, you're doing something pretty insane. In terms of raw power, this might be the most powerful card on the list. Shortly after being printed, it was pretty clear it was a mistake. In 1994, as Wizards was planning on having the first Magic World Championship, they started restricting cards that were too good, and the Workshop was one of those. As Magic has continued to develop formats over the years, Mishra's Workshop has been on and off the ban and restricted list in various formats, but since 2004 it has only been legal in Vintage. It's just too good at producing fast mana for other formats. In Vintage, it is at the heart of one of the best decks in the format, an artifact-heavy deck often called Ravager Shops because of the deck's reliance on the Workshop and powerful artifacts like Arcbound Ravager. All of the bannings have meant that Mishra's Workshop has been held to only 102 points because it hasn't had many opportunities to gain them anywhere but in Vintage. It is an impressive feat that it has managed to amass more than 100 points despite those limitations, and one can only imagine how massive the score would be if it had never been taken out of other formats, but then, if Wizards hadn't acted and this was just allowed to run amok, it might have destroyed the entire game. It's that powerful. At number 9, I have 3 cards, the so-called Tron Lands. I have them together because they are always played together. These are the 3 Urza's lands originally printed in Antiquities. On their own, they can just tap for a single colorless mana, but when you manage to assemble all 3 of them, you have access to 7 mana from 3 lands. So, like Mishra's Workshop, the upside with these colorless lands is the absurd amount of mana they can produce. The Tron Lands did not make a major impact on the game as a result of their original printing. There were just way more broken ways to get fast mana, and it also wasn't that easy to get all 3 of them into play in those days. All of that eventually changed though, and the Tron Lands would later be reprinted in 8th edition. When that happened, they started to see play. They could help decks power out an early Tooth and Nail, something that is pretty difficult to beat. Tron decks also found their way into Extended, but the format where they have really shined is Modern. The format was created in 2011, and pretty much continuously since then, Tron of some variety has been a Tier 1 deck in the format. There, it is most frighteningly used to power out things like a Turn 3 Karn. More recently, the Tron Lands have found themselves in a variant called Eldrazi Tron that also runs Eldrazi Temple and a bunch of Eldrazi because who wouldn't want another land that produces a bunch of mana, right? These lands are going to continue to amass points and move up this list. At number 8, it is Darksteel Citadel. The Citadel is probably the least flashy card to make this list. at least at first glance, compared to the lands on this list that are capable of obviously powerful things. Sure, it's indestructible, but is that really enough to offset the problem that it can only produce colorless mana? If the Citadel was a regular old land with indestructible, it probably never would have seen play. The key to the Citadel's power is that it is also an artifact. Having that card type opens up a whole world of possibilities. The Citadel is actually part of a whole cycle of artifact lands originally printed in Mirrodin. The other 5 produce colored mana, in addition to the fact that they also have the artifact type. These lands ended up being far more powerful than Wizards probably imagined, and this was largely because of the affinity mechanic. In those decks, the artifact lands, including the Citadel, effectively produced 2 mana. Those decks also ran a bunch of other cards with artifact synergy, like Shrapnel Blast, and being able to sacrifice a land to something like that is pretty nice. In the end, these artifact lands were too powerful, and they all ended up being banned from both Mirrodin block and Standard. While the Citadel escaped getting banned and extended, most of the rest of the Affinity deck was banned pretty quickly, so it didn't manage many points there. When the modern format was created in 2011, the Citadel was the only artifact land that didn't get banned in the initial ban list for the format. As a result, it has seen a ton of play in Modern, where Affinity decks, like Tron decks, have been a fixture since day one. The Citadel has also managed a few more points in Standard after getting reprinted in Core Set 2015. There, it of course also saw play in an artifact-heavy deck, but one of the sweetest things that deck could do was put Insoul Artifact on it, which gave you a 5/5 indestructible creature as early as turn 2. This deck has largely been ported to the Pioneer format as well. At number 7, it's City of Traders, a land that can produce 2 colorless mana without any restrictions of where you can spend it. Of course, the city does come with significant downside. Not playing lands the rest of the game is a pretty big hit to take, but if you plan for it, this can give you a nice mana boost when you need it. If you end up with multiples in your hand, you can also tap the one already in play for 2 mana and then play the other and immediately tap it for mana 2, so the downside, while relevant, isn't the end of the world. It has found most of its success in decks where casting one big Haymaker spell can end the game, and it helps you get to that spell a turn early. Basically, the idea is, the downside won't matter because the game will pretty much be over as a result of the spell it helps you cast. In Standard, it was played in Wildfire decks, and Extended, it was played in Goblin Charbelcher combo decks, as well as in decks looking to cast Tinker as quickly as possible. Legacy has been its most frequent home. There it's been played in decks looking to cast Sneak Attack and Show and Tell as early as possible, and it's also played in Reanimator decks and Eldrazi aggro there. In Vintage, its primary homes tend to be artifact-heavy decks like those running Mishras Workshop, as well as Eldrazi aggro. At number 6, it is Mishra's Factory. One good way to offset the downside of only producing colorless mana is to offer some additional utility that most lands can't. In the case of the Factory, it's a creature land. It can turn into a creature if that's what you need, whether you're looking for an attacker or need a blocker. It can also pump assembly workers, which includes the Factory itself, so if you have multiples, you can use them to pump the Factory when it's a creature. Creature lands tend to be quite powerful because of their amazing utility, producing mana when that's what you need and turning into a creature if that's what you need. The fact creature lands can dodge most board sweepers and other sorcery speed removal spells makes them especially interesting. In Standard, it was primarily featured in aggro decks, since it could provide a fairly resilient creature against control decks. It was also featured in extended aggro decks, but some control decks running board sweepers also liked to run it, as it made sure they had something left on the board after they cast something like Wrath of God. In Legacy, it's been played primarily in aggro decks like Merfolk, Stoneblade, Eldrazi aggro, and Death and Taxes. In Vintage, it has mostly been played in artifact-heavy decks like Mud and Ravager Shops. Like all of the cards on this list, the Factory is going to continue to gain points going forward. At number 5, it is Rishadan Port, a land that lets you tap down a land your opponent controls every turn. While the port doesn't quite destroy a land, it does a great job of really making sure your opponent will have less mana both on their turn and on your turn, assuming you tap down one of their lands during their upkeep, or maybe just on your turn if you tap down one of their lands at the end of their turn. This is effective against just about anyone, but can be particularly frustrating for control players who need to leave mana up to do stuff on your turn in many cases, but the port doesn't allow them to have as much mana as they would like. the port's power was evident pretty quickly. It was a staple in both block and standard. At the Masks block constructed Pro Tour in 2000, it was played in all 8 of the top 8 decks. It had similar completely absurd performances in standard too. This included 7 top 8s at Worlds in 2000, 6 top 8s at Pro Tour Chicago in 2000, and 5 top 8s at Worlds in 2001. In short, making this a card that just takes up a land slot in a deck was probably a mistake, because any deck could run it if they wanted to, and it's too powerful for that. While it didn't achieve the same dominance in Extended, it was still fairly prolific there, and was still played in a wide spectrum of decks ranging from Tinker to Goblins to Reanimator. Legacy is where it has done the most and where it still sees play today. There, it is mostly played in 2 different decks. One of these is Death and Taxes, a deck that tends to run a lot of tax effects. In other words, cards that make your opponent have to pay extra mana to do stuff, like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. If you can start tapping down one of your opponent's lands in play, while you've also got something like Thalia lying around, it's going to create some serious problems for them. It also sees play in Legacy Lands decks. These decks run a whole bunch of lands, as you might assume, and have multiple ways to tutor them up. You can find the port whenever you need it in that deck, and that's pretty sweet. The port has also been played in Vintage Mud decks. At number 4, I included 2 cards because they are very similar to one another and are often played in the same decks. They are Inkmoth Nexus and Blinkmoth Nexus, and they both represent the same location on the plane of Mirrodin. One of them before the Phyrexians came, Blinkmoth Nexus, and one after the Phyrexians came, in Inkmoth Nexus. Inkmoth Nexus is the legit number 4, and Blinkmoth would have been number 10 on this list. Both of them are powerful creature lands, largely modeled after Mishra's Factory. They can both become artifact creatures for 1 mana, and they can pump other Blinkmoths. The difference between the two is that the Blinkmoths are 1/1s with flying. Blinkmoth Nexus is the older card. It was originally printed in Mirrodin block like Darksteel Citadel, and it gave you another land that could be an artifact. Blinkmoth Nexus has been played in affinity variants across multiple formats over the years, although after the printing of Inkmoth Nexus, it did start to see less play. This is because Inkmoth Nexus brings Infect to the table, meaning you basically only have to do 10 damage to an opponent for them to lose the game instead of the usual 20. While both of these lands don't seem like the most imposing creatures, the problem with them is that it is really easy to make them massive in affinity decks. This can be accomplished with either cranial plating or +1/+1 counters from Arcbound Ravager. These lands give affinity decks creatures that are immune to board sweepers or sorcery speed removal, and these guys can really end a game in a hurry. Both are continuing to see play, though Blinkmoth Nexus at a lower rate than its younger counterpart. At number 3, it's Ancient Tomb. This is another colorless land that overcomes its limitations by being able to produce extra mana, and in this case, the downside isn't nearly as much of an issue as the one that came with City of Traders. It just damages you every time you use it, but it is well worth the price for fast mana. One really stupid thing, by the way, is that both Ancient Tomb and City of Traders were legal in Standard at the same time. Seems like a good idea, right? Like City of Traders, Ancient Tomb was played in Wildfire decks in that format. It was played in the same kind of decks in Extended too. Tinker, Goblin Charbelcher, and so forth. It was also played in the same kind of decks as the City in Legacy. However, where it really gains its advantage is in Vintage, where it has a huge 102 points. Ancient Tomb's Vintage points alone would have been enough for number 10 on this list. There, it is a fixture in Ravager Shop's decks, as it gives you another land capable of producing a ton of mana, in addition to Mishra's Workshop. At number 2, it's Muta Vault, another creature land. Muta Vault is quite similar to Mishra's Factory. Both are colorless lands that can transform into 2/2s. That is already a pretty powerful card. Muta Vault has something extra going on for it though, and that is that it possesses every single creature type. This makes Muta Vault a particularly attractive option in tribal aggro decks, in addition to being a nice thing to have around in just about any aggressive deck. Muta Vault was originally printed in Morningtide, and it dominated Lorwyn block constructed, where it was basically a staple. Lorwyn block was heavily tribal, and so were the decks that found the most success in the format, like Fairies, Kithkin, Treefolk, and Merfolk. It really showcased its dominance by putting up 6 top 8s at both Grand Prix Birmingham and Kobe in 2008. It was also played a bunch in Standard. This included in tribal decks like Fairies and Elves, but it was featured in just about any aggro deck. Muta Vault received a second printing in Magic 2014, one that Wizards has since said they really regret doing. This is because it made it legal in Standard, and because it was just a colorless land that any deck could play. It was ubiquitous in the format, seeing play in just about every deck there was. It also had some success in Extended, where it was primarily featured in Merfolk and Fairy decks, and in Modern, where it also saw play in Fairies and Merfolk, and more recently in Eldrazi tribal decks. Its points in Legacy come almost exclusively from Merfolk decks. Alright, at number 1 I actually have 3 cards: Wasteland, Strip Mine, and Ghost Quarter. These are all lands that destroy lands, and the list would have been much less interesting if I let them all take up multiple slots. Wasteland is a legitimate number 1 with 303 points, Strip Mine would have been number 6 with 166 points, and Ghost Quarter would have been number 6 with its 157 points, and fun fact, the number 11 card on this list was Tectonic Edge, so it almost ended up being 4 of these that made the list. So, as we saw with Rashad and Port, denying your opponent mana is a powerful thing. These lands are all capable of permanently destroying lands at the cost of sacrificing themselves. All of them can do it for free too, essentially amounting to them being a more flexible 0-mana land destruction spell. Of all of them, the most powerful one in a vacuum is certainly Strip Mine. It doesn't restrict what kind of lands you can destroy, it just lets you destroy whatever land you want. It has its points held to 166 because it has been deemed too powerful for most formats, having previously been restricted in Standard and banned in Extended. It is also banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage today, where it's a staple. Wasteland really benefits from the fact that Strip Mine isn't legal in Legacy because it's the premier land-destroying land in that format. As a result, it can only destroy non-basic lands, but there are enough of those around that Wasteland usually has stuff to blow up. So basically, Strip Mine is the premier land-destroying land in Vintage, and Wasteland is the premier one in Legacy. Meanwhile, Ghost Quarter is more about Standard and Modern. Ghost Quarter has the downside of allowing your opponent to search up basic lands after you destroy one of their other lands, so the idea there is often just to blow up a non-basic land and downgrade their land, but it also has some additional functions that the others don't have. For one thing, you can use it on your own lands if you're in desperate need of fixing. One of the nastier things you can do with Ghost Quarter is combine it with either Aven Mindcensor or Leonin Arbiter, at which point it does basically become Strip Mine. All of these are going to continue to be played in their respective formats, and it's hard to imagine them ever loosening their hold on the top of this list. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. Let me know in the comments what color of lands you want me to look at next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the ones I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.